Welcome back to Those Happy Places, the podcast that treats theme park rides and attractions like literature. I'm Buddy Duquesne.
And I'm Alice White, and this week we'll be talking about the Hollywood Tower of Terror and the new reskin of the ride at Disney California Adventure, which is called Guardians of the Galaxy Mission Breakout. Which, by the way, Buddy, I had to do a lot of research into figuring out how to punctuate the name of this ride. It is Guardians of the Galaxy Mission Breakout! Exclamation point.
That's right. What a wonderful introduction. Today we want to answer a question that's been burning at the back of fans of both rides' minds. Namely, what does this reskin mean? What does a reskin do that building a new ride, for example, or demolishing an old ride doesn't do? And finally, how does theming affect audience experience of identical motions? And I think, Alice, if we really want to start this thing off right, we should jump right in and get to our special guest caller for the week.
Absolutely. Our very dear friend, Charles Gustine, has sent us an awesome clip. He was the inspiration for the topic this week. We chose to talk about these rides because he specifically requested them. And he sent us this really awesome clip with some of his thoughts and opinions to get us started.
Hey there, Alice and Buddy. This is Charles Gustine, your well-timed GIF correspondent on Twitter and host of a podcast about icons. So I'm really excited to be calling in or MP3ing in about a ride that feels especially emblematic, iconic at the park it's in, MGM, or I'll always call it MGM. Like, I can't think of another ride other than Tower of Terror that takes up so much of sort of the mind space of a park, so much of the percentage of what you're kind of thinking about when you go to that park than Tower of Terror does at MGM. Like, to give you some context into the MGM that I grew up on, which was kind of the mid to late 90s, right around when the Aerosmith Rock and Roller Coaster opened up across the way from Tower of Terror, it's this weird dead end, which is so rare in a Disney park, that you would go down this long corridor at the bottom right of the map. I have no idea the cardinal direction you're going in when you go that way, but it's the bottom right of the MGM map, and you go down there pretty much just for Tower of Terror and the Rock and Roller Coaster, and you have to go back up. You know, it's like a 5-minute walk. There's no circular path that gets you to the other parts of the park, which would be death to most theme park areas. But of course, I think mostly, I mean, it's the thrill ride part of the park, but I think it's also the Tower of Terror is the true weenie, the true e-ticket of MGM, to the point where, you know, controversially for forever, the supposed weenie at the center of the park, the thing that's supposed to draw you in, Grauman's Chinese Theater, was covered with this stupid Fantasia Mickey hat for forever. I think that the thing with Tower of Terror and why there's this instinctual defensiveness of it, even at California Adventure, where there's still a bunch of other Tower of Terrors in the world, one of them being taken away and replaced with a Marvel property, is it feels like Tower of Terror is the only ride of its generation, of the early 90s, late 80s, that kind of immediately got grandfathered in to classic status, you know, the caliber of the e-ticket attractions that the original Imagineers were making with Walt. And so there's obviously this sort of reflexive anti-blockbuster bias when people are like, oh no, Guardians, Marvel Land, which is sort of silly when it comes to Tower of Terror, because of course it's the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror, so it's not an original property, although it is an original story within sort of an anthology. But I think more so it's like a reflexive dread at something like a Tower of Terror being vulnerable to the creep of refits. Like, if this could go, is nothing sacred? And it is sort of sacred to me. I think it's one of the first rides that really gave me an appreciation when I was younger that that Imagineering was something more than just designing a ride, that it was designing the line, the pre-show, organizing your references, getting the dust just right in the lobby space, getting mahjong, professional mahjong players in to halfway play through a game and then telling them to stop, so that if someone coming through the lobby looks at a half-finished mahjong game, they're not taken out of the experience like, they clearly don't know how mahjong works. Like, it's no small wonder to me that the Tower of Terror, actually ended up being the ride that inspired the first sort of ride-based movie, the one that starred Steve Guttenberg and Jumanji-era Kirsten Dunst in the mid-'90s, and that they could peel away the whole Rod Serling Twilight Zone layer of it, which is kind of the front-facing story, like, oh, you're here, you're in a Twilight Zone episode, that's sort of what you're experiencing. They could peel all that away, and there was still this really solid core of a story about, Halloween night, 1939, and the raining, it's pouring, the old man is snoring. That whole iconography actually was strong enough to build an entire script around without having to do too much to it. I mean, more so than the upsy-downsy part of it, which, of course, is a lot of people's favorite thing. What always struck me about Tower of Terror, like Haunted Mansion, was the milieu, the atmosphere, the beauty of that building and the way that it's sort of decayed since quote-unquote 1939. So I'm really excited to hear you guys talk about it, and to talk about it in contrast with the Guardians of the Galaxy ride, which I confess I won't know anything about because I'm not in California. So I hope you guys can enlighten me. Thanks.
Thank you, Charles Gustine.
Charles, that was awesome, and thank you so much for sending in that clip. We're so excited to have you influencing this episode, and I'm looking forward to talking about some of the points you brought up. But we should probably clarify maybe for some of the audience, a couple of specifics.
We when listening to this knew everything that Charles was talking about, and definitely didn't have to look up some of his history and terminology. So we thought,
I definitely already knew what a weenie was. Uh-huh.
So Alice, I thought that just in case the audience who is listening did not know some of these terms, we could kind of share what you and I knew. We grew up knowing. We knew this the whole time.
Definitely always knew all of this.
So Charles, your audio clip was mostly about the Disney World MGM Studios Tower of Terror, which, listeners who are only really familiar with the current era of Disney might not know that when what is now called Disney's Hollywood Studios opened in Florida, that it was originally called MGM Studios. And it was a kind of tie-in licensing deal between Disney and kind of the now defunct, not so influential MGM production studio.
Right. MGM used to be one of the biggest studios in Hollywood and was such an icon of Hollywood that it made sense to license a Hollywood-themed part of the park with MGM. But that stopped making as much sense, and Disney started... Disney's film department really got a resurgence in their own right, and took that licensing was removed, and it just became Hollywood Studios sometime in the 90s.
Yeah, sometime in the late 90s. And the important thing about MGM as a licensing partner is that it lent a certain air of 1930s nostalgia to the Hollywood Studios kind of aesthetic, and the great movie ride, which a lot of fans are very, very into, focused a lot on both Disney and MGM properties. So there were things like, you could go and see a set from Wizard of Oz and the witch would pop up. She would do a whole witchy thing, and there was also a Mary Poppins thing. So you could see how kind of the two giant companies who are responsible for a lot of our nostalgic memories around movies were able to kind of meld their aesthetics. And I think the Tower of Terror, which opened in 1994 at what was then called MGM Studios, embodies that, right? It embodies the kind of combination between the two. But Tower of Terror is not, or Twilight Zone is not an MGM property.
No, it's a CBS property, based off of the Twilight Zone television show that started in 1959. And by licensing it alongside the MGM properties and the whole Hollywood Studios theme, the Hollywood Tower of Terror is that 1930s old Hollywood aesthetic combined with the big theme park ride, like big e-ticket ride that Disney was looking for to put in that spot. And it became such an iconic part of the scenery. It's a lot taller than most of the scenery around it. It's imposing, it's scary, and it became in that part of the park what I definitely already knew was called a weenie. I admit I definitely had to look it up. Charles,
we had no idea.
To me, I was so embarrassed that I didn't know. But once I looked it up, it all makes sense. So for those who, like me, maybe didn't know what a weenie was, a weenie is a Disney term, or a slang term coined, I guess, by Disney. It is a piece of the park that is like a magnet attraction. It's visually eye-catching. It's meant to draw not just the eye but the feet to that part of the park. And some Disney weenies include the Cinderellas or Sleeping Beauty's castles, Tower of Terror, the Matterhorn. These big pieces of architecture that are specifically meant for, it's like, and the word weenie comes from, I guess, Disney. Walt would grab a weenie or a hot dog from the refrigerator and share with his dog, Lady. And he realized that she would follow him anywhere while he was holding the hot dog because she knew that he was going to give her some. And he realized that kind of idea of like, it's kind of like a carrot in front of the horse to get them to go somewhere. You give them something to aim at. You give the audience a visual goal to reach, and their feet will lead them in that direction. And so you put something like Tower of Terror, a weenie, and a part of the park, in a kind of a dead end part of the park, to draw people into that space. And it maybe gets them to walk into a space they wouldn't have considered before in order to get to this big weenie. God, I didn't want to say that.
But this kind of tantalizing, interesting, eye-catching promise of a thrill, or promise of something that is, beyond the normal experience, right?
Exactly.
And on the surface, it's actually a dead simple kind of logical concept. It's like, hey, if you put something interesting somewhere, people are going to move towards it. But I think what separates, say, like a Splash Mountain or maybe a Space Mountain, which are big e-ticket rides that attract people, from a weenie like Tower of Terror or the Cinderella's castles or Sleeping Beauty's castle, is that it's part of the skyline as well. And you can kind of look up and see it in the distance and feel yourself drawn towards it.
Right.
And we're seeing kind of more examples of that as the parks sort of expand. So I'm kind of thinking of the backdrop of Radiator Springs, this mountainside.
I was just going to say
hill,
that.
right? That's its own kind of weenie. And you go like, wow, there it is. I got to go towards that.
Exactly. Hogwarts Castle at Universal Studios is a good example of that.
And that's at the
when
end.
You spot it from a distance.
That's at the end of Hogsmeade, right? So you have to go all the way to the end to get there. And that keeping people moving and kind of stretching out where the crowds are does improve park flow.
Right. So it's not just giving you a narrative or a place to go, but it's acting as a physical journey. You have to move, and it keeps the park flowing, and it eliminates spacing problems, and it's practical as well as narratively interesting.
Yeah, so that's thank you, Charles, for introducing us to the concept of the weenie, and I think maybe someday we might make a longer episode about it, but it was worth exploring a little bit here when we're talking about Tower of Terror, because it became that for California Adventure as well, in my opinion.
Right. It totally spiced up a part of the park, like we talked about in our earlier episode about California Adventure specifically. Tower of Terror was not part of that original skyline, and it was a part of the park, like we said, we did not especially spend a lot of time in. But it was super effective drawing us into that space and getting us to explore more of Hollywood studios because Tower of Terror was there.
And it very much, just like at MGM, is in a back corner, not next to anything else. It's next to the Hyperion Theater and a path to a Bug's Land, which will soon be closed off due to construction. So it's going to be really isolated. And keeping people moving into that corner of the park increases foot traffic again, and makes sure that the Tower of Terror, unlike rides like Haunted Mansion or Pirates of the Caribbean, which have extremely large capacities for throughput, isn't really a guest eater, I would say, right? It doesn't get people occupied in it.
Right. You can fit a lot of people in the building. Like, they've got a lot of line space in the building. Mm-hmm. But you can't, even though you can have, as I was reading, you could have multiple cars per elevator shaft, the way that it's laid out. You don't get it. It's on an Omnimover track. You don't get like a constant flow of people. It takes a while to load everybody. It's a big thrill ride, so you have to spend extra time making sure everyone is strapped in and safe. So it often, the line is super long for it.
Yeah. So maybe we should kind of start talking about what exactly Tower of Terror as a ride is. So it's described as an accelerated drop ride, meaning that the ride was advertised as pulling you down, not simply dropping you, quote unquote, faster than the speed of gravity.
Ooh.
So you experience a little bit of weightlessness, but it's interesting because both Florida and California's version of the ride had a top speed of only 39 miles an hour at its fastest drop, which doesn't sound that fast if I'm thinking about relative speeds.
I don't know, but when you're on it, it feels really fast.
It does feel extremely fast, and there hasn't been a time when I've ridden it when I haven't floated a little bit and been like, oh, here it goes, it's happening. So, I mean, it's certainly fast enough to thrill. So, the number doesn't really matter so much as the experience, right?
Right.
And then maybe we should start to talk about our favorite concept, the immersivity of the ride.
Yes, you gotta love immersivity. Again, as we've mentioned in almost every episode, Disney really does excel at immersivity. As soon as from walking up to the Hollywood Tower Hotel, you're given this aesthetic that even stretches to the line, to the area right outside the ride. Wait in line, and there's cobwebs, and like Charles said, there's the mahjong game that's half played.
And
so you can't just look at the board. A mahjong player can't just look at the board and be like, "Oh, that's not realistic.
That's not a real mahjong game."
And so you you are immediately drawn in during the line, during the pre-show, during all of it. It is a masterclass in how to get people absorbed into the world. And it's spooky and it's scary, and you get like a Twilight Zone intro from Rod Serling, or a really good Rod Serling impersonator.
How that effect was achieved, because Rod Serling was not alive when the ride was being made, was actually a lot like those scenes with JFK from Forrest Gump. If you remember that technology.
Yeah.
So archival footage was used. They kind of interspersed him in with new footage of the ride and of the backstory of the ride. And then when he wasn't saying what they needed him to say, they didn't digitally alter his image at all, but they would cleverly hide the new dialogue over the other footage. So you only saw Rod Serling speaking when he was saying words similar to what they needed him to be saying at the time. And they had a voice actor, of course, do an impersonation. So anyways, it was a very, very interesting effect that, for me, was so immersive and so kind of true, and so it felt so connected to the aesthetic of the Twilight Zone, the actual show, that I believed it as a real thing that Rod Serling had like posthumously done. Maybe he had recorded part of the intro before he had died or something like that.
Truthfully, I thought that before, when I was young enough to not know, I thought that the movie, the Twilight Zone movie, was based off of an episode of the Twilight Zone that I hadn't seen. And that so that the episode became a movie, became a ride, and that's why we had a Rod Serling intro. I thought it was the intro like to the original episode, but then they were like,
yeah.
But then he was like, "You're about to,
Tonight's episode of the Twilight Zone, it calls for a different sort of introduction, and it stars you, right? Like,
right?
Oh,
that's where
it kind of.
That's where I felt like, oh, this is probably, now it's probably an impersonator, like.
Yeah. And that's a really interesting way to kind of welcome the audience in as well, right? Is to say, like, here's the theme, well, not theme song, because Twilight Zone didn't really have a theme song, but kind of a. Okay, first of all. It's not how it sounds. It's just how everybody says. Like, and second of all, but the way that the show introduces itself, it's kind of a narration over images. It's kind of a theme narration, for lack of a better word. It's not really as musical as, say, like the theme song of Cheers, right? Or like
right.
theme song of The Simpsons.
No, but it is an intro, and it's a classic. And even I wasn't a fan of the show growing up, but even I was familiar with it. It was culturally prevalent. Like
right.
You said, like you, when you were giving me examples of it while we were planning this episode, you sent me all the Futurama references to the Twilight Zone, stuff like that,
right,
which would have come up. The scary door. All of that which would have come up just in the zeitgeist, even, for a young kid like me when the ride came out.
Right. So it didn't really necessitate that you were familiar with the Twilight Zone, but being familiar with it kind of lent to the immersivity, where you were kind of just watching an intro to what could have been a pretty good episode of The Twilight Zone, but then Rod turns to the camera and goes, "Tonight, The Twilight Zone stars you. Tonight, you're in an episode of The Twilight Zone. In fact, you're already there."
It's taking immersivity super literally.
Yeah, and that kind of turn to the camera and wink thing is pretty unique, and it's an interesting story structure for a ride to take, to say, like, years ago a thing happened. Now that thing is happening for you, and you might not survive. And I think we were talking about this a little bit in our planning, is that's a really scary proposal. A lot of.
Cool,
Hmm?
but it's not original, is it? Isn't that pretty much
Not really.
exactly what the Haunted Mansion promises you?
It does promise you
That you might not make it out alive, right?
Yeah, and that there's room for one more, right? Like there's room for 1,000. Is a key line. It kind of increases the threat level of the ride. And that's interesting because the Haunted Mansion and the Tower of Terror share a few other similarities, namely pre-show. So the Tower of Terror's line is in, I would describe it as 3 stages, maybe 4, depending on how you want to look at it.
But depending on
There's
how long
exterior.
you have to wait.
Right, depending on how many people are there. So there's the exterior, which is just kind of a overgrown kind of exterior of a hotel. It's pretty well themed. It's not too outstanding, but you can look at the Tower of Terror. You can hear people screaming inside, so that's fun. You go into the lobby, and again, the cobwebs, the mahjong game. There's a creepy doll on a couch. You can see the busted up elevator in the lobby. And you're like, oh, what happened there? I hope I get that explained to me in the next room. And then you move into the office, which is like the pre-show proper, right? So there's this collection of creepy artifacts, and then the lights go out, the Twilight Zone intro starts, and then Rod tells you that you're now in the Twilight Zone. Then the doors open again, and finally you are in line for the ride. Which is just like going from the exterior to the Haunted Mansion to the lobby or the foyer and then to the stretching room. Those stages are perfectly mirrored, I would say.
Yeah.
So where you would get off the elevator in the Haunted Mansion and go through the Hall of Strangeness, the gallery and the rotating heads, here you go through the boiler room. And that adds to the atmosphere a lot, too. There's all this clanking and noises that sound almost like human speech and very, very good lighting. And, of course, the bellhops who are working the ride are doing the spooky Haunted Mansion thing where they're, like, morose and they kind of glide along. And when everything is firing on all cylinders, the Twilight Zone, I would say, or the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror, is just as well themed in terms of queue as a Haunted Mansion. The one thing I would criticize it on is probably that the Haunted Mansion is built for that sort of pacing, whereas the Tower of Terror very much feels like they wanted to achieve that, but because of the e-ticket nature of the ride, it's much slower.
Right.
And you don't really get that constant build-up that you get with an Omnimover system, which I will praise forever.
Yeah, your very favorite thing, the Omnimover system. If the Hollywood Tower of Terror could be on an Omnitrack, you could keep that pacing and you could keep that tension. But going through a line and then watching a spooky film about how your life is in danger only to stand in much, much more line is...
behind the same people that you were in line behind before.
Yeah.
And
maybe not even possibly not in front of the same people that you were, maybe because you get shuffled into a room and then everybody finds their way out and all of a sudden you're like, oh man, I was in front of that guy.
Now you're like 6 people behind where you were. Jeez. And yeah, that's another problem, I would say, is that because of that, you're almost motivated to like go stand by the door, and that breaks immersivity.
But that's the same, I guess, with the stretching room, with the elevator in the Haunted Mansion.
That's true.
You get shuffled.
You and I, when we were Disney punks, we would go and stand right by the door,
so we could be the first ones on the ride. But with the Omnimover track, you're not waiting that much.
You don't lose any time, I would say. So it was kind of just us being
punks
ourselves, yeah, Disney punks. So. But they really are similar rides structurally for the queue. Now, when you get on the ride, they're very, very different. And there is that sense of danger, right? Like, the narrator says, like, you're in the Twilight Zone now, wave goodbye to the normal world. There's a room that the doors open up on where there's a mirror, and you can watch yourself wave goodbye, and then you get zapped out of existence. And it's like, well, I guess we're not getting off this elevator alive. It's very scary.
It is super scary.
Especially for little kids. And I think we can kind of transition here because the mission : Breakout.
Guardians of the Galaxy mission : Breakout !
Sorry, I didn't mean to mess up the punctuation.
Very important.
Mission Breakout is not that scary.
No, it's not
at all. And that's interesting. So maybe we should talk a little bit about, what happened. Why do we have Mission Breakout? Why are we even talking about it right now?
Right. So, along with, and you can go back a little bit to our California Adventure episode also, we talked about this a little bit, but along with the remaking of California Adventure and kind of the restructuring into, DCA 2.0, we're starting to see a lot more additions to the park and changes in the park relating to some of Disney's bigger acquired properties, such as Pixar and Marvel. And so they're restructuring Paradise Pier to become Pixar Pier. They added Cars Land. They're adding a Marvel Land. And pretty much the first step, though, that they took was reskinning Hollywood Tower of Terror into Guardians of the Galaxy Mission Breakout. And they didn't take out the tower. They barely even covered it up. It was just like some scaffolding. And then all of a sudden it was a different ride.
It's a common complaint from the people that I've seen talking about the ride on Twitter is that the exterior reskin could be considered lackluster from a certain point of view.
Oh, I think it's funny.
Yeah, I agree that it looks like it's right out of a Marvel movie. It doesn't, I don't buy it as the collector's fortress because that's not how it looked in the movie. It looks a lot more like Jeff Goldblum's character's planet from Thor Ragnarok.
Right, but aren't they supposed to be brothers?
The whole building is covered in metal and pipes. Yeah, they are brothers. That's canon.
Awesome.
So, yeah, I could see that. I could see how it works. And I think it looks fine enough. And especially at night, it's lit up very well.
It's very, very pretty at night.
We should note that California Adventure's Tower of Terror, which opened in 2004, was not a day one attraction, right? California Adventure opened in 2001, and as part of the immediate response to the negative backlash and criticism that DCA 1.0 was receiving, Tower of Terror was kind of added in as like an addendum, like, oh yeah, just kidding, another thrill ride, here you guys go. And it had a couple of very important changes that separated it from its counterpart in Florida. So, for example, in Florida, there's an entire scene where the car moves forward through what is called the fifth dimension, and then it begins the drop sequence. That's not present in DCA's Tower of Terror. There's also randomized drop sequences at Disney Hollywood Studios, which we do not have in California.
No.
Though that would change a little bit with Guardians of the Galaxy.
Right. So instead of randomized drop sequences, Guardians of the Galaxy
we have these
randomized
plot sequences.
Right.
But perhaps most importantly about Tower of Terror, and I think we'll get to this a little bit later as well, is that it was a popular ride that nobody really had a lot of complaints about. It was a solid thrill ride that consistently had an hour queue for it, and that was never really changed. There wasn't any unpopularity or any criticism of the ride.
No,
as far as I could tell.
It was a lot of people's favorites, at least people our age and older. It's not a children's ride. It is a proper e-ticket thrill ride. but it was still very, very, very popular. And sometimes it felt like the only reason to go to DCA at all. At least when we were
True enough. If you could stomach the wait, which was usually substantial because it was a big deal.
Right.
So in 2017, a couple of weeks after Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 was released, Tower of Terror reopened, branded as Guardians of the Galaxy Mission Breakout. So do you want to talk a little bit about what the plot of this ride is?
Sure. So there's a couple of different plot specifics that change from ride to ride, but as a whole, you are as the audience brought into the collection of the collector, who was a fixture in the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie, played by Benicio del Toro.
Not really a villain so much as a benevolent eccentric who kind of features heavily in the universe.
Right, and he's
also an antagonist kind of guy.
Yeah, he definitely wasn't a hero, but I refer to him as a fixture for a reason. He's not a hero or a bad guy. He's just a guy, and he's got this big collection, and he's the one that knows about the Infinity Stones, and he gives us the breakdown of what the Infinity Stones are. And so it's a set piece and a character that we, the audience, as fans of Guardians of the Galaxy, should be familiar with. So we step into the collection, and while you're there, you're treated to a little bit of a welcome, and thank you for coming to take this tour. And you step into the room that was the office where you used to see the Rod Serling video. And you're getting an intro like, hi, welcome to the collection. This is how it goes. And suddenly you're interrupted by an extremely cool Rocket Raccoon animatronic.
This is probably my favorite animatronic ever, by the way. Like, you can see...
so cool.
You can see the sneer on his face when he emotes, and his whiskers kind of twitch. And you only see half of his body, but, his tail moves along, and it's extremely cool. Like, I think animatronic technology has kind of stalled in a lot of ways because we're not seeing as much of it. We're seeing a lot of screens.
Right.
But when they do it, when they put in the effort, they nail it these days, and this is such a cool animatronic. It is completely unlike anything else in Disneyland.
He's very cool, and he's so funny. And straight out of the movie, he's cracking jokes and threatening people, and he's letting you know that all of this is a facade. All of this, this tour and everything is a facade. That the collector has the remaining.
They've taken the Guardians prisoner. Yeah.
Right, they're prisoners, and they're kind of even on display as part of the collection.
I think that was part of the draw for you, the character. If you're kind of playing in the universe, it's like, oh, we get to see the Guardians of the Galaxy. Like, how exotic, how wonderful. I think is part of your stated motivation. And that's really interesting. So he breaks out, and then he takes a look at you, and he's like, look, I need your help, right?
Right. I need your help. I need that guy's eye. I need that guy's leg. And we're gonna break out my friends because we've got to go save.
He needs your hands. He needs your hands. He needs to be able to scan your fingerprints so that the gantry lift gets access to the level where the Guardians are being held.
Exactly. So
because he doesn't have fingerprints, he has little nubbins.
Aw. So then you go, and by the time, you wait in a little more line, and by the time you get on the elevator, you help Rocket and Peter Quill and Gamora and Baby Groot and Drax break out of the collection. And you, and the elevator is malfunctioning, because Rocket has, taken control of it. So that's what's with all the drops and lifts and stuff like that. And then you help your heroes escape, and that's the end.
Usually at the end of the ride, they thank you for all of your great help. And that's an interesting thing to do to the audience, right? To say, you're involved in this, here's your small bit part to play, raise your hands at the right moments so that the Guardians can escape.
Clap your hands if you believe in fairies,
Yeah, exactly. Because it's going to happen regardless, right? So it reminds me a little bit of Indiana Jones, the ride,
right.
Temple of the Forbidden Eye, where I've always wondered if there could be a version of the ride where nobody looks into the eyes of the idol.
Right, where you agree with your car.
Watching. Yeah. If you could have somebody watching and be like, oh, they did it, and they like press a button and there's a switch and your car just like turns around and you're safe. Like, obviously not, right? Wouldn't be much of a ride. Would be a waste of everybody's time in the line.
Plus, I will always stare defiantly into the eyes of the idol. Like,
that's funny because I used to avoid it, but now I look because, like, I'm a full-grown adult and I can do what I want. But
it's
funny to say to the audience. It's funny to say to the audience, you have responsibility in this. You're helping out or putting us in more danger depending on your actions. So make sure you act the right way in this completely scripted, predetermined series of events. And it's always come off as a little disingenuous to me. Like, what exactly is my involvement? My involvement is to be along for the ride and experience it. So could there possibly be a version of this ride where everybody defiantly keeps their hands down and Rocket has to like yell at you until somebody does it, or like something like that, so that it's truly interactive? Like, no, of course not. But it's an interesting way to welcome the audience into the world, anyways.
Right, and there are heroes. There's no reason for us to not raise our hands and help out.
Right, we want the Guardians to escape. They're fun, and we love them. And plus, cool music is playing.
Plus, really cool music is playing. So this is where the cool music that's playing is where the the different plots start to diverge. You've got 6 different, well, not wholly different. A lot of them have things in common, but you have 6 options. When the elevator starts moving, suddenly you either hear Hit Me With Your Best Shot by Pat Benatar, Give Up the Funk by Parliament, Born to Be Wild by Steppenwolf, I Want You Back by the Jackson 5, Free Ride by the Edgar Winter Group, or Burn in Love by Elvis Presley. And those 6 really great songs, one of them will play. And depending on which one plays, when Rocket gets the Walkman plugged in and starts your soundtrack, a different plot happens. Sometimes you go up to a level and you see Gamora fighting the monster, and sometimes you go up and it's Drax and he's laughing and making fun of you while he's fighting. Sometimes you see Star-Lord trying to fly around, but he gets, wrapped up in the tentacle monster or whatever. Like, while they're trying to escape, they're running into trouble, and it's different. Each one is different. A couple of repeating jokes, but they are different. This is a variant ride.
Yeah, and variant rides are kind of a newer technology that definitely warrants its own episode as well, because the ability to kind of change things from ride to ride encourages audience retention, right? If you haven't seen all 6, you might as well get back on the ride.
Right, I've only seen 2 of them.
Same with me. I've only seen 2, and that's between 3 different rides. So that means you don't even have a guarantee that you'll see a new one every time. So, you end up back on the ride a lot of times. And there's a real desire to be back and see everything that the ride has to offer. Not to mention, there's one more variation on Guardians of the Galaxy, the Monsters After Dark variation.
Did you get to ride Monsters After Dark?
No, but I believe you were saying that you did.
I did. I made a special trip over. Last time I was at Disneyland was right before Halloween. made a special trip over to specifically to ride Monsters After Dark, and it was so much fun. It's the same. I mean, it's the same ride. There's not really a whole lot different about it, but it felt so special to be there. To all of a sudden, like, the lighting changed on the front, you know, and you're like, ooh, this is after dark. Like, this is where, you know, it just felt, I don't know, special.
Yeah, and the idea there is that it's much spookier, and that the monsters are a little bit more dangerous.
Right.
And Rocket needs your help to, like, rescue Baby Groot. Right. So it's kind of like a different plot.
It's a sequel to Mission Breakout, actually, because it's supposed to be like, we've escaped the collection, but we left Baby Groot behind, and now all the monsters are loose, and we have to go save Baby Groot. So it's still a breakout story. I know. So it's still a breakout story, and it's still like the drops and everything are still the same, but it's a little scarier. The stakes feel a little higher, and it's like, if the Mission Breakout kind of feels a little more on the childish side, what with the, raise your hands so Rocket can get your fingerprints and all of that, like, feels like for a little bit younger audience, Monsters After Dark definitely took all of that away, and it became, and it wasn't necessarily raunchier, but Rocket is kind of a raunchy character. Like, he's cracking jokes that go over most kids' heads, you know, and
yeah, and he's a little mean too. That's one part of the fun of the Guardians themselves, is that they're outlaws, so they're not goody two shoes. They're not Captain America.
But they are not total dicks.
Yeah, exactly. So it's funny you should mention kind of a continuity between the versions of the ride, right? Because we discovered in our research that Mission Breakout is not part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It features the same characters, the same actors, the same versions of those characters, presumably with very similar backstories and experiences and relationships, but it is non-canon to the MCU. But it is canon to its own theme park universe, which presumably, as it grows and builds as the new Marvel Land that they've just announced continues to grow, will have its own continuity, which is really, really fascinating to me, that we can kind of have a continuity within the park as well, featuring your cinematic universe heroes.
Right. I'm looking forward to seeing what else they come up with, because I love the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and so far I love the theme park universe because I love this ride. I love Mission Breakout.
Mission Breakout is a very, very fine ride, and I would say I like it just as much as I ever liked Tower of Terror.
I look forward to it as much as I did Tower of Terror.
Yeah, they're very different rides, right?
Right. They're very different, tonally, but not structurally. But
not structurally, and not physically. Not physically. So maybe we should get to the next part of the episode where we talk about what exactly happens in a reskin, or rather, what a reskin is and what it means between these two rides specifically. Because at the end of the day, the only thing that was changed about Tower of Terror when turning it into Mission Breakout was its theming. There was a pretty extensive overhaul of that theming, but the motion of the ride has remained identical between the two. They have identical stats, identical drop patterns, nothing about them has changed, identical seating arrangements, but the theming has changed, and as a result, audience response has changed with it. And you were talking about how you really love the lighthearted kind of adventure tone of Mission Breakout, and how it kind of contrasts against Tower of Terror's kind of morose, dangerous tone.
Right, exactly. I really get a kick out of the kind of humor from Guardians of the Galaxy. I love the fast-paced music. I love how it feels like an interactive adventure. I think opening it up to a kind of childish participation almost makes it fun and fresh. And
raise your hands to help the Guardians is a lot of fun. It's a fun feeling.
Clap if you believe in fairies.
Right, even if you don't know, if you know that it's not real, even if you're not a kid there being told what to do and just taking delight in that, it's
totally
fun.
still do it. I definitely put my hands up.
I could not put my hands up. That's the thing. I feel invited in. I feel like I'm part of the experience, even though consciously I know I'm not.
Right. And while Tower of Terror was a huge success in its theming and its thrill, and how, the ride was good, and that hasn't changed at all. I think opening this up, not just to this property, but to this tonal shift, has really opened up the ride to a bigger, more accessible audience.
Accessibility, I think, really is the word here.
Right. It's no longer that spooky tower in the distance. It's still a weenie. It's still going to pull you towards it because it's big and shiny and pretty, but it's no longer scary. It's fun and something to be excited for and look forward to.
My one memory of the Tower of Terror in Florida comes from my trip in 1996 when I was basically a baby. But I was tall enough at the time, I believe, to ride it. But tell a 6-year-old it's the Tower of Terror. It's very scary. And they'll be like, oh, I'm never getting on that. Because I think I might die. Right. But tell them the Guardians of the Galaxy need your help. You got to raise your hands and have fun. I feel suddenly this is a ride that's accessible to everybody who's tall enough to ride on it, basically.
Right. And I when I went on it, actually, because I rode it 3 times in one day with my mother back in October. And the very last time that I rode it, we were sitting directly next to, this is cute, because you can get to Mission Breakout from Cars Land. Mm-hmm. You can walk. And so we went on the Radiator Springs Racers and then walked to Monsters After Dark with our Fast Pass. And the family right in front of us, they sat with us on my mom and I did single rider on Radiator Springs. And then we just so happened to be walking in the same direction. We went from Radiator Springs, a super little kid, area, to Mission Breakout, After Dark, Guardians After Dark. And the same small child rode with us on both rides. And he was a little boy. He was barely tall enough to ride. And he looked spooked by, it's dark and it's kind of spooky. But as soon as Rocket started to speak, he was laughing. He was there. He was present and even though it was scary, it was still accessible and he was able to enjoy both rides equally. I'll remember that kid forever. He had the funniest little laugh and he was just so excited.
And I think that's probably the goal here. As much as we might kind of lament the loss of yet another spooky ride, is that the brand or the storytelling style that Disney wants to promote? And being able to put a little kid on a ride where his heroes need his help, and so that he can have a good time, but also you can please the thrill seekers as well, is a masterstroke, in my opinion. Right.
I completely agree. I don't ever want to forget what it felt like as a child to go to Disneyland and to ride the rides with characters that I loved and that meant something to me. I don't want to forget what that feels like. Even as an adult, I don't want to be so focused in my adultness and my adult level cynicism to forget what it was like to love something so much. And at the way that only children can love something, you know?
Yeah.
I don't want to forget that.
And I think that part of the reskin was that it kind of opened us back up to that, by kind of being more innocent in that way, where Tower of Terror, I guess in order to write it repeatedly, you almost had to build up a tolerance within your suspension of disbelief, where you say to yourself, I must not completely suspend my disbelief because I need to realize that this is not actually a dangerous situation.
Right, because it is very, very scary. It was proper scary.
Right, and by saying this actually isn't dangerous, this is wacky fun, it has dropped that pretense from, like, at least my experience as a writer. It's dropped that pretense, and now I'm raising my hands, you know, and now I'm laughing and having a really good time and saying, like, woo, when it happens, like when we drop, I'm getting into it. Instead of being, like, stone-faced, like, this isn't scary, this doesn't bother me, because I'm a full-grown adult and I can do what I want. Instead, I'm just like, woo, this is a great time. And that shift in tone can do that for people.
But I just wanted to counter my own point for a second. I want to acknowledge that when I say, or when we say that, you know, like, Disney is for families, and I want to be able to feel like a kid again, riding these rides and stuff like that, I recognize that a lot of people get that feeling of feeling like a kid again from the pure nostalgia of a ride that they were already familiar with. And even the property of the Twilight Zone being so important to a lot of people's, like, introduction to television or introduction to the science fiction genre. That is enough to trigger that feeling in people. This, like, kind of joy and nostalgia and, like, I feel like a kid again. I'm just so happy to be here. I think that is totally valid for people to feel. Like, and yet I think that if we're going to, I don't know, again, I don't know how I feel about this part. Maybe because Guardians is more accessible than Twilight Zone, like, it can reach more people. That's why it seems so effective. But maybe it doesn't always have to be about numbers. We don't just have to reach the most people. We just have to reach the right tone and hit the right, like, level of, like, sensitivity to people's nostalgia.
That's an interesting question, and because from a business standpoint, I think, you know, the people in charge of making changes at Disneyland might tell you that it is about the numbers.
I was saying, however, they're not. They didn't just slap the Guardian's face on it and then just, like, leave it. They put in the care and work and effort to make sure, and James Gunn directed these new scenes and everything to specifically make sure that it's not a sloppy reskin, that it is a genuine tonal shift in this direction that, like, felt authentic and real, and, like, it cared about what you, the fans of Guardians of the Galaxy, felt.
Yeah.
It's not a mindless reskin. It's a meaningful one.
Yeah, it's not without artistic merit. And I think you were getting to something kind of really complicated that might warrant its own episode. You cannot make the argument that these happy places that we talk about are not art, right? They are an art form.
Right.
And art doesn't need to be about being 100% accessible all the time. But we were throwing around the subject of accessibility a little bit, and this will definitely be an episode later, because the question of accessibility at theme parks, especially for those with differing abilities and different capacities, being able to be included in these experiences that are so beloved by so many, I think that should be a goal of the art form as well. And being able to fulfill those numbers is not this meritless, like, oh, it's all about the numbers, man, pursuit, where in fact it's much, much more important than simply making the ride that you think is the most thrilling or the most scary or hits such and such a tone. It's being able to put more people on it in like a broader sense.
Right. Not just butts and seats, but people legitimately engaging in the experience.
Right. And being able to share that experience as widely as possible. But speaking of kind of the nostalgia that fans feel, especially for the Tower of Terror, now that the difference between simply replacing a ride and reskinning a ride is that the ride is still there, right? So Tower of Terror is still there, except that's not the Tower of Terror anymore. That's Mission Breakout, and so it's there but not there. And I could see how that's kind of an uncomfortable experience.
Oh, I just had a thought. It's a little bit why like Charles in his recording will still call it MGM Studios.
Right. It's that the park is still very much there. It's why I still want to put an apostrophe S on Disney's California Adventure.
Right. It's hard to make that cognitive switch.
Yeah, because Disney has had an extremely long history of recycling pieces of rides or even recycling rides wholesale with maybe a theming twist. So I think that brings me to my next example, if you wouldn't mind.
Not at all.
So this is really interesting. Indiana Jones, Temple of the Forbidden Eye, -- The Indiana Jones Adventure, / Please Ride This Ride, & Enjoy It, I think is what it's called. But the Indiana Jones ride at Disneyland is a fantastic ride. Agree or disagree?
Agree.
Thank you. So it's an amazing ride, very well themed, very thrilling. One of my favorites, one of my all-time favorites in the medium, one of my all-time favorites in the adventure genre. I think it does a lot in the right way, and it's a great adaptation of the Indiana Jones style as well. So that ride
it almost just feels like another Indiana Jones movie. So.
Yeah, practically, except you're inside of it. So that whole ride, with its track design still intact and its innovative ride vehicles which can move independently of the track, very, very cool, were taken wholesale and reskinned as the dinosaur ride at Disney's Animal Kingdom. So the ride is identical. Movement, twists and turns, the way that the track is laid out. The main difference is the way that the ride is themed as this trip back in time to retrieve a dinosaur. And while the dinosaur ride kind of doesn't really have the popularity of the Indiana Jones ride, and I think that actually comes down to the popularity of the property, and perhaps that Disney's Animal Kingdom has a different focus. It's kind of outside of the e-ticket attraction. I haven't really heard criticism of this kind of quote-unquote lazy reskin, this reuse of an entire ride system down to the track at all. And I've wondered, like people are like, oh, Guardians of the Galaxy is such a lazy reskin. But nobody says this about Dinosaur versus Indiana Jones. And I was talking to Charles Gustine about this on Twitter to bring Charles back in, kind of the third man on this podcast, I would say. to bring Charles back into the conversation, though, Charles was saying that he's been on that ride, dozens of times, and it never occurred to him that they were identical.
So people that only go to Disneyland or people that only go to Disney World would have no idea of each other's rides.
Right.
Of Dinosaur versus Indiana Jones.
Exactly.
That's wild.
Isn't that crazy?
I didn't know that.
So there's a certain level of an information gap. And before you and I started this podcast and we had kind of theme parks on the brain all the time, that was a fact that I didn't really consider, is that there are rides at Disney World, which is immense and is 5 theme parks and has all of this stuff going on, that I actually haven't heard of yet, just like you. And that I'm finding out are reskins or reimaginings of beloved Disney attractions. For example, Body Wars was at Epcot, and it was an identical ride down to the motion with Star Tours. It was the same seating arrangement.
Really?
Classic Star Tours and Body Wars are the same ride. Not to mention the practice at Disney of recycling animatronics or recycling set elements, such as the reuse of America Sings animatronics on Splash Mountain. I mean, like,
right.
We'd like to think that Disney is constantly innovating and putting out these new ride systems and adding things all the time, but in reality, they're a company like anybody else, and they're trying to maximize efficiency. And you can do that by reusing things. And if you can do it convincingly and without people taking too much notice, you can do something truly, truly wonderful in that nobody will ever say anything about it.
It's just Disney magic.
Yeah.
It's that like weird ephemeral quality that Disney has, that where the things that they touch and do it correctly feel magical, like they've been grown out of the ground.
Yeah.
And when the theming is correct, you don't feel like you're on a ride at a theme park in the middle of Southern California. You feel like you're in the space.
Or space.
And, ooh. So if you notice that the animatronics get reused, if you notice a reskin, if you're aware, if you follow Disney news, if you take part in Dis Twitter and you're paying extremely close attention, it can kind of bring you out of the magic. But if it's done correctly and seamlessly and thoughtfully and not sloppily, it can be really great and do really cool things for the theme park.
Yeah, and so to kind of bridge this to our audience interactions section, for one person for whom I think the reskin really didn't work was our friend on Twitter, Sassy Captain Rex, who himself was a victim of a reskin when Star Tours was reskinned, right? Poor Captain Rex.
Captain Rex from the
left on the floor of Star Tours. Don't worry, Captain Rex, you're coming back as DJ Rex in Star Wars Galaxy's Edge.
So excited.
But cannot wait for Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, and this has been our weekly freak out about Star Wars Galaxy's Edge. But Sassy Captain Rex was saying that we posed this question out to Twitter, like, what did you notice about the reskin? Do you miss Tower of Terror? Like, what are your emotions on this? And Sassy Captain Rex said that this was our tower in California. Like, it may have been, by some people's estimation, the inferior version of a ride that already existed in Florida. It doesn't have the fifth dimension. It doesn't have the varying drop sequences, but that it kind of felt like it belonged to us in California. And I can kind of understand that, especially given this kind of new perspective we have now as Tower of Terror as the weenie of the entire park, right? This big e-ticket icon. And that it really did fit the theming of California. Like, this is Old Hollywood Hotel. Like, here it is. And all broken down and gross because it's from the 1930s, but like that's what makes it thrilling is the spooky hotel. And we don't really have that with the reskin. What we have now is kind of the Marvel world building that is incomplete. It's as yet to be seen. And that architecture was really important to Captain Rex, he was saying. And that's interesting because for Rex, I think, and this is something he says, what really angered me about the change to Guardians was that the tower was a relatively young ride that people loved, and that maybe he felt that there wasn't quite enough time to like let it become a Disney classic, the same way that we might say like Pirates of the Caribbean has had an incredible lifespan, 60-ish years of running daily and having minimal changes made to it. Same with Haunted Mansion, these fixtures, and that Tower of Terror might have almost become that. And it really did kind of fit into the world, and there really wasn't a connection to the Florida version, where people weren't like, well, it's just a lazy reskin. More like, yeah, this makes sense here. This feels real. And they were kind of achieving what we were talking about, which is that, through the information gap of us not really thinking about Florida's rides all that often, it felt natural. It felt like it belonged. And I thought that was a really nice sentiment, Captain Rex. I might not agree that Mission Breakout is a cash grab per se, or that it's all about the merchandising and the tie-in. But I think that that's a really interesting thing to kind of bring up, is that we felt like it was part of DCA. It was kind of part of home. And I think that makes sense.
No, it does make sense. I admit, when I first was reading the comments on Twitter, my gut reaction was to disagree entirely. But no, thinking about it again in the context of the conversation we've just had, I think that is a very thoughtful way to put it. Like I'd like to see, I think, some statistics, if anybody who's listening has these. I want to see some numbers on how many rides are the same between the two parks, between Disneyland and Disney World. How many rides are the same, and which ones were Disneyland originals and which ones were Disney World originals, and like how the two parks share IPs, like how the two parks share rides. Because yeah, he's right. The Tower of Terror, or you're right, I don't remember who said it first. The Tower of Terror in its old Hollywood glam kind of feels like it belongs to California, but it started in Florida, and that maybe we should have kept Tower of Terror, but Florida should have reskinned, because like it fits our California theming better,
Sure, I completely understand. If the mission of California Adventure is still to kind of be a California showcase, except, fanciful and crazy and thrilling, then maybe we should have kept this old Hollywood thrill ride. But if the mission has changed to perhaps, if the mission has sort of broken out of that shell, then I think what we're seeing with Mission Breakout is really a realignment that is still in progress at California Adventure towards being more a new showcase of Disney's new properties and these new worlds that they're willing to create. And that's what I'm excited for with the reskin, is that this is a preview, and we're going to soon be experiencing all sorts of Marvel theme park universe stories, which is so incredible
it's gonna be
to
great,
even imagine.
Because with very few exceptions, I have loved all of the new Marvel Cinematic Universe stuff. Very, very few exceptions. I have found it all thrilling and fun and exciting. And I think that if they put as much thoughtful effort into the rest of Marvel Land as they did Mission Breakout, it could be incredible.
Well, Alice, our time talking about the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror and Mission Breakout has come to an end.
I think you mean Guardians of the Galaxy -mission : breakout !
And Breakout is in a different font, yes. We are done talking about these two rides and their reskin and that effect on them. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode if you're listening in. And this brings us to my favorite part of the episode, when we get to shout out to all of the cool people that we are meeting through the podcasting community on Twitter and elsewhere. So first, I'd like to give a special shout out to our friend and contributor, Charles Gustine.
Charles, you're the best.
Thank you so much
Always
for that call-in. And really, it has been incredible the way that you've given us all sorts of feedback and ideas for the show. Charles's show is called Iconography, and you can find it anywhere that podcasts are sold. Do we sell this? Is it sold?
No. In fact, we pay to do this. So.
Oh, well, you can find it anywhere that podcasts are bought by their creators and then given away for free. I'd also like to do a special shout out to the hosts of Adapt or Perish. Their names are Ariel and Jeremy. They're a married couple, and they do this podcast about adaptations. And I've just started listening to you guys. I listened to your Princess Bride episode right before we started this, and we found you guys thanks to Charles. So thanks again to Charles, and thank you to you two for the work that you do. They can be found at adaptorperishcast.com. Really great podcast.
I'm so excited to start listening. The Princess Bride is my favorite book and film. So glad to be able to interact with them on Twitter. This is going to be great.
Definitely. And a couple of other cool interactions that we've had on Twitter since our last episode. I got to talk to Nando V Movies, one of my favorite YouTube personalities. We talked a little bit about his, speaking of Marvel, his theory that Rhodey from the Iron Man series might be a Skrull, which is one of my favorite theories about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So definitely check him out. He also has a great video about Ego from Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, and the kind of the pastiche of characters from the comics that Kurt Russell's portrayal was. So I thought that was really interesting, and it was just so cool to talk to one of my favorites on Twitter. So thank you, Nando. Everybody check him out, Nando V Movies on YouTube. We also have a lot of great interactions with people like the Diz Dude on Twitter, and Ken Pellman, who hosts a podcast about cleaning the kingdom. He worked for a long time in custodial at Disneyland, and he's got a lot of great stories about that. So,
oh my gosh, definitely listen to Cleaning the Kingdom. It's so good.
To all of you guys who interact with us on Twitter, it is one of our greatest pleasures and privileges while making this podcast to be able to shout you guys out. So thank you all so much. You are all wonderful. This is a great community, and we hope to hear from you guys some more as we continue to produce this podcast.
And special shout outs and thank you to Sassy Captain Rex for your contribution to this episode, and as always to the dearest darling Kate Prince,
special correspondent,
her patience and kindness. Special correspondent Kate Prince for her patience and kindness and the giving up of her living room space so that this podcast can exist.
Can continue to exist. We got a couple of really busy weeks coming up, so you may see some different content from us in the next couple of weeks, but we hope you stick with us, and here's the outro. Thank you for listening to Those Happy Places. I'm Buddy Duquesne.
And I'm Alice White.
The research for this episode was done by Buddy Duquesne and edited by Alice White.
This episode was edited by Buddy Duquesne and produced by Alice White.
Our theme music is Golden Gate by the California Feetwarmers, featuring Phil Alvin. Find the Feetwarmers on YouTube or on their website, CaliforniaFeetwarmers.com.
And if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and tell your friends. Send people to our website at www.thosehappyplaces.com and join us on our Facebook page at facebook.com/thosehappyplaces, where we're always talking about theme parks and ideas for future episodes. We're also on Twitter.
That's right, I'm at Buddy_Duquesne. Duquesne is spelled Duquesne.
And I'm at Alice White, THP, for Those Happy Places.
Thanks for listening, and we hope you return to those happy places.